I watched my husband drown 3 years ago. Today, I saw him buying instant noodles in Paris. I'm aware of how this sounds. If I were reading this instead of writing it, I would already be forming neat little explanations in my head. Trauma, hallucination, grief projection, a stranger who happens to share a face. The human brain is excellent at stitching familiar features onto unfamiliar bodies. I've considered all of that. But the human brain does not invent birthmarks in the exact same place. 3 years ago, I watched my husband disappear beneath a wave. Today, in a small grocery store in Paris, he turned his head toward me. And for half a second, his face opened in recognition before he sealed it shut like I was a threat. And I know what I saw. I was 20 when I married Brian. Yes, it was fast. Yes, everyone said so. But when you meet someone and the conversation flows like you're picking up a dialogue, you started in another lifetime. Waiting feels unnecessary. We met in a bookstore cafe. I spilled coffee on him. Not a little splash, a full, humiliating arc of iced latte across his pale blue shirt. I apologized so many times I ran out of synonyms. He laughed. Not annoyed, not awkward, just warm. Good thing I was bored, he said. This is the most exciting thing that's happened all week. I should have rolled my eyes. Instead, I offered to buy him another drink. He insisted on buying mine instead. We ended up sitting across from each other for 3 hours, books forgotten between us. He asked me what I was reading. I lied. Something intellectual, something that sounded impressive. He narrowed his eyes playfully. Try again. I laughed and told him the truth. That was the first moment I realized he liked honesty more than performance. By the end of the week, we hung out together so frequently. I basically memorized his coffee order, his favorite terrible 90s action movies, and the fact that he hated cilantro with a level of passion usually reserved for political debates. By the end of the month, I knew the cadence of his footsteps in hallways and the way his voice softened when he talked about wanting a family someday. We got married 5 months later. It felt right. There was no need for either of us to wait and test the bond when we knew we truly loved one another. I know if it were anyone else except him, it could have turned into a nightmare for me. But it didn't. Brian was still my best friend. His family, however, did not attend. They were wealthy in the quiet, intimidating way, the kind of wealth that comes with legacy and expectations and carefully arranged futures. I was none of those things. My parents are kind, hardworking people who celebrate paying bills on time as if it's a personal victory. To his family, I was a downgrade. They gave him a choice, to either choose me or them, and he chose me. I remember asking him if he was sure, if he would resent me later. I distinctly remember interrogating him about this matter very seriously. I did not wish to take him away from his family. And I definitely did not wish for him to regret it down this irreversible path. He cupped my face and said, "You're not the one I'm giving up. You're the only one I'm choosing." That should have been romantic. In hindsight, maybe it was also a warning. We moved into a tiny apartment that smelled faintly of old wood and ambition. The plumbing groaned like it was reconsidering its life choices. The stove sparked sometimes before lighting, which Brian insisted added character. We were broke in the beginning, not dangerously so, but tightly. We budgeted groceries. We bought furniture secondhand. We learned how to stretch meals into leftovers that somehow tasted better the next day. And we were so immensely happy. Something straight out of the movie. Maybe better since it was my reality. He brought me flowers every Monday because I hated Mondays with dramatic flair. Floral intervention, he called it. He made tea when my PMS week turned me into an unreasonable critic of everything he did, including breathing. He'd wake up in the middle of the night if I so much as shifted restlessly and pull me closer without opening his eyes fully. When I had nightmares, he didn't ask for details. He just stayed. He never talked about his family, not with bitterness, not with longing. It was like they had been edited out of his life story. If I asked gently, he'd shrug. They made their choice, he'd say. So did I. I loved him unconditionally. I thought that was enough. When I found out I was pregnant, I stared at the test for a full minute before calling his name. My voice was full of disbelief and cracking with emotions. He thought I was hurt because I sounded strange. He nearly broke the door trying to get to me. When I finally shared the good news with him, he stared at me as if I'd just told him gravity had been optional this entire time. Then he started laughing. He dropped to his knees and pressed his forehead against my stomach, even though there was barely a curve yet. "I'm going to be a dad," he kept saying, like the sentence itself needed repetition to become real. He was ecstatic. He couldn't, smiling the entire time that day. His eyes were always full of admiration and gratitude. Throughout the first trimester, he read parenting blogs like they were survival manuals. He tracked my cravings. He refused to let me carry grocery bags. He kissed my belly every morning before leaving for work. But around 7.5 months, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic, it was microscopic. The kind of change you only recognize when you replay memory later and notice the flicker in someone's eyes. He became vigilant. I thought it was just one of the phases every new father goes through. I assumed he was afraid to lose me or the child. His hand lingered on my stomach longer than before. Not affectionate, intent, like he was memorizing the shape. He stopped holding eye contact for too long. At night, he shuffled in bed. Not fully restless, but never quite settled. He didn't leave my side unless absolutely necessary. And even then, he called. Are you okay? Yes, Brian, I'm sitting on the couch. Do you need anything? No. I'll be home soon. I teased him about hovering. You're acting like I'm fragile. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're everything to me, he said instead, meaning heavy in the air. I simply did not realize the gravity of their words just yet back then. We planned a small baby moon trip before our baby arrived. Nothing extravagant, just a modest beach town a few hours away. One last adventure before diapers, he had said. The first day was perfect. Sunlight spilling gold across the sand. The ocean calm enough to lull you into believing it was harmless. The next day, the morning when it happened, he woke up earlier than me. I remember because I felt him watching me. When I opened my eyes, he smiled softly. Morning, I mumbled. He brushed hair from my face, kissed my temple. The kiss lingered. We returned to bathe under the bright sun that afternoon. I'm going to swim for a bit, he said, to clear my head. Don't drown, I joked lazily as I stretched my heavy limbs on the sand. The warmth of the sunlight was so welcoming that day. His smile faltered, just slightly. Take care of yourself meanwhile, he said solemnly as he kissed my temples firmly. I didn't think much of it. He has been protective of me all this time. He cared for me. I fell asleep under the sun, warm and heavy with late pregnancy exhaustion. I woke up to shouting, a commotion hard to ignore even if sleep tried to pull me back in. At first, I thought it was playful noise, perhaps some children or teenagers splashing water on one another. But then I heard urgency. I pushed myself up, blinking against the brightness. A crowd had formed near the shoreline. Lifeguards were running. Someone pointed. And then I saw him, Brian, too far out. His arms weren't waving, they were fighting. The water looked deceptively calm, but he was being pulled sideways, dragged further out. I screamed his name. Nearly damaged my vocal cords in that act itself. I rushed towards the shore, my hands shaking as I supported my belly. Before I could even think of following in him water to try and rescue him, an elderly couple held me back. They held me firmly so I did not rush in behind him in a moment of pure panic. The lifeguards dove in instead, but to no avail. A wave rose so violently, Brian disappeared behind it. And when the wave, he was gone. They searched for hours. A whole rescue team was sent out with boats and life jackets, but every boat returned empty. Brian was never found. The shock of losing my husband instantly sent me into labor right there on the sand. I howled as my knees buckled beneath my weight. For some moments, the world was non-existent. The pain of losing Brian was much worse than physical pain. I couldn't take my eyes off of the ocean, hoping my brain would somehow reappear. But he didn't. Ambulance arrived soon enough to carry me to the hospital instead. And from there, my memory is vague, patchy. I remember the hospital lights, the smell of antiseptic, signing papers with shaking hands. Charlotte was born small, premature, furious at the world for dragging her out too soon. The same day she inhaled her first breath, her father exhaled his last. Or so I believed. They never recovered a body. Which, people will tell you, is worse. Because you never get closure. You just get silence. I moved back in with my parents a month later. They turned their home into a refuge. My father built a crib in his study so I wouldn't have to climb stairs. My mother relearned how to sterilize bottles and operate on 2 hours of sleep. Grief and newborn exhaustion blur into something almost functional, and Charlotte grew healthily under our care. No matter the grief, no one ever compromised on Charlotte's well-being. She was our anchor. The only reason I was still alive. Literally. She has his eyes, the same shade, the same slight crinkle when she smiles, and a birthmark under her eye, just like Brian. By the 3rd year, I could say his name without breaking. I still missed him every day. Still stared at his pictures longingly, but I could breathe without collapsing. We came to Paris 4 days ago. My parents insisted I deserved a real vacation, somewhere beautiful, somewhere not shaped like a coastline. I was still afraid of beaches, though. The water body, the sea. I only take showers and no bath. Neither have I ever allowed Charlotte to enter a bathtub. Call me paranoid, but I lost one loved one already. I cannot take risks any longer. Therapy eased the nightmares I had, but it's self-protection to refuse going near any water deep enough to drown you. That morning, I went to a small neighborhood grocery store. Charlotte insisted on pushing the basket. She steered it like a reckless driver, bumped the cart into other people's toes, and her cute little apology made it harder for anyone to get mad at her for it. Meanwhile, I was comparing cereal boxes when I felt something. Not a sound, a shift. You know how sometimes your body reacts before your brain understands why? I looked up. He was standing at the end of the aisle, back turned, reaching for instant noodles. Dark hair slightly longer than before, shoulders broader. Dressed like any local man, simple jacket, straight jeans. But the slope of his neck, the angle of his jaw, my pulse stopped. He turned slightly, and there it was. The small birthmark beneath his right eye, a dot of brown ink against skin. The same as my Charlotte. The basket rolled into my ankle. Charlotte was saying something about chocolate cereal, but I couldn't hear her. Not when my dead husband was standing 15 feet away, and he looked tired. Not sick, not injured, just worn, hollow under his eyes, a crease between his brows like he carried something heavy and invisible. I stepped forward without feeling my legs move. "Brian?" I whispered, close to unraveling right there. The word fractured in my throat. He froze. For half a second, his face lit up. Recognition, relief, joy. But then it collapsed. Like someone had flipped a switch inside him. He straightened, smoothed his expression. "I'm sorry," he said, voice controlled. "You must be mistaken." I stepped closer. "No," I whispered. "No, it's you." More certain this time. Charlotte looked up at him. She studied his face carefully. Then she said, soft and uncertain, "Daddy?" When Charlotte said daddy, the word didn't echo. It landed. Soft, uncertain, curious. But it landed exactly where it was meant to. The man in front of us flinched like someone had pressed a bruise. His eyes, those eyes, flicked down to her, and I saw it. Not confusion, not polite detachment, recognition. It wasn't possible. He had never held her. Never seen her outside of sonogram printouts and hospital dreams I invented to survive. And yet his expression broke in a way that only fathers break. Then he caught himself again. His jaw tightened. His hand dropped the packet of noodles back into the shelf with mechanical precision. "I think you are mistaken," he repeated, slower this time. The accent was wrong. Brian never had an accent. This one was subtle. French-laced English. Controlled. Manufactured. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Look at me," I demanded. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. He looked, and for a second, the grocery store dissolved. The fluorescent lights, the faint hum of refrigeration units, the distant clatter of carts. None of it existed. It was just us. 3 years of grief, sitting between two people, pretending not to know each other. "You drowned," I whispered. His throat moved when he swallowed. "I'm sorry for your loss," he replied. That did it. Anger rushed in where shock had been. "You kissed me goodbye," I said, stepping closer. "You told me you'd be right back." A woman pushing a cart slowed down beside us, sensing something sharp in the air. I was vaguely aware of Charlotte gripping my coat tighter. He shifted his stance slightly, not retreating, but bracing. "You're confusing me with someone else," he said carefully. "Then explain the birthmark," I snapped. His hand instinctively moved toward his face before stopping mid-motion. "Small mistake." Charlotte stepped forward. Toddlers don't understand social performance. They don't recognize tension unless it's loud. To her, this was simple. The man in the pictures. The face she's traced with her finger on our living room wall. She let go of my hand and walked straight to him. I should have stopped her, but I didn't. She reached up, wrapping her arms around his knee. The contact visibly shattered him. His shoulders stiffened. His breath hitched. His hand hovered awkwardly in the air like he didn't know whether he was allowed to touch her. Then instinct overruled restraint. His palm rested lightly on her head. His expression was painful. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a cinematic embrace. It was small, careful, but real. I saw moisture gather at the corner of his eyes before he blinked it away. "You shouldn't do this," he muttered, not to Charlotte. To me. "Do what?" I demanded. "Recognize my husband." He looked around the aisle then, scanning, not nervously, strategically, as if checking who was watching. That's when I noticed something else. He wasn't dressed randomly. His clothes were simple, yes, but too intentional. Neutral colors, no logos, no accessories except a plain watch. Even his hair, longer than before, was styled in a way that subtly altered the shape of his face. It wasn't a glow-up. It was camouflage. "Please," he said quietly. "Lower your voice." My chest tightened. This wasn't someone who thought I was mistaken. This was someone afraid of being recognized. "Brian," I said again, deliberately. His eyes snapped to mine. The name hit. There it was again, that crack in his composure. "You have the wrong person," he said, but it came out thinner this time. I stepped closer until we were nearly chest to chest. "You used to tap twice on the table when you were anxious," I said. "You hated cilantro. You made me tea during PMS week and held me even when I yelled at you for existing." His hand twitched. Tap, tap. He clenched it into a fist immediately after. Charlotte looked up at him, confused by the tension, but unafraid. He crouched down suddenly so he was eye level with her. Up close, I could see how exhausted he looked. Not malnourished, not ill, just worn down, like someone who hadn't slept deeply in years. "What's your name?" he asked her softly. "Charlotte," she said proudly. The name visibly struck him. His breath stuttered. "You did name her Charlotte like we talked about?" he said before he could stop himself. Silence. The grocery aisle hummed. My blood turned cold. "You remember," I said. He closed his eyes for 1 second too long. When he opened them, something inside him had shifted from denial to containment. "Not here," he said, firmly. The words were barely audible. My pulse hammered. "Not here," I repeated. "You don't get to decide that." His jaw tightened. "If you want answers," he said quietly, "you need to trust me for 5 more minutes." Trust. The word felt obscene. "You let me believe you were dead." A flicker of pain crossed his face. Not defensive, not angry. Pain. "I know," he said. Charlotte reached up and touched his cheek. Toddlers do that when they sense adults are upset. He leaned into her touch before catching himself. "I can't do this in public," he murmured. "Please." There was urgency in his tone now, not aggression, not threat, fear, not of me, of something else. 5 minutes, he repeated. I should have called the police. I should have screamed. Instead, I nodded once. He stood, picked up the noodles again like nothing had happened, and walked toward the checkout. I followed. Every step felt surreal. He paid in cash. Who pays in cash in 2026 unless they're avoiding a trail? He didn't look back to see if I was following. He knew I would. Outside, the Paris street buzzed with late morning life. Cafes clinking, scooters passing, conversations flowing in French. He walked half a block before turning into a narrow side street lined with shuttered storefronts. I stopped a few feet away from him. Charlotte clung to my coat. He faced me fully for the first time. Up close, there was no denying it. The scar near his chin from when he slipped on our apartment stairs. The faint crease between his brows when he was thinking. 3 years older. Hardened. But Brian. "You're alive," I said. It wasn't a question. He nodded once. "Yes." The world didn't tilt. It narrowed. "Why?" My voice cracked. "Why would you let me think you drowned?" He exhaled slowly, like someone preparing to detonate something controlled. I didn't have a choice. Rage flared. "You always have a choice." "Not this time." I stared at him. "You watched me go into labor," I said. "You knew I was 7 months pregnant." His face paled. I didn't watch. The correction was immediate. Instinctive. Something cold slid into my stomach. "What does that mean?" He looked up at the sky briefly, then back at me. "My parents," he said quietly. I felt the word like a draft under a closed door. "I thought they disowned you." "They did," he said, publicly. There it was. The first fracture in the version of reality I had been living in. Charlotte shifted impatiently, sensing the tension, but not understanding it. He crouched again, softer this time. "Hi, Charlotte," he said gently. She studied him carefully. "You look like my daddy," she said. His lips trembled slightly as he admitted, "I know." I stepped forward. "You need to explain. Now." He stood again, eyes locking onto mine. "They threatened me with you," he said. The words landed without context, heavy and incomplete. "Threatened you how?" His jaw tightened. "You weren't supposed to survive that pregnancy." The air left my lungs. "That's not funny." "I'm not joking." My mind rejected it outright. "You're saying your family tried to—" "Yes." The word was sharp. "They gave me an ultimatum," he continued, voice steady but strained. "Leave you. Annul the marriage. Or they would make sure you and the baby never became a problem." My heart pounded in my ears. "You're lying." He shook his head once. "I thought I could protect you by staying," he said. I was wrong. The street suddenly felt too open, too exposed. "You think faking your death was protection?" I demanded. It was the only way to make them believe I wasn't tied to you anymore. The pieces didn't fit yet. They hovered around each other without clicking. "They're powerful," he continued, "influential. Connections everywhere. If I left you openly, they would have watched you anyway. But if I died—" His voice faltered slightly. "If I died, there was nothing left to leverage." My skin felt cold despite the mild weather. "You staged it." He nodded once. The ocean roared in my memory. The lifeguards diving in. The wave. "Who else knew?" I asked. He hesitated. "That's complicated." That's not an answer. Footsteps echoed faintly at the end of the alley. He glanced past me. Subtle, controlled, but deliberate. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. He wasn't just afraid of his past. He was still afraid now. "We don't have much time," he said quietly. My stomach dropped. "Time for what?" He looked at Charlotte again, then back at me. "This was all supposed to end when they died," he said. The words hung between us like a fuse burning too close to the wire. And for the first time since I saw him in that grocery aisle, I felt something colder than anger. Fear. I repeated the sentence in my head twice before it made sense. "I read in an article that your parents died last year," I said slowly. "In a jet crash." "They did," he replied. "Then what bothers you still?" His gaze shifted past me again. This time I turned to look. At first I didn't see anything unusual. Just a narrow Parisian side street, pale stone walls, closed shutters, a single parked delivery van, a woman at the far end lighting a cigarette. Then I noticed the car. Black. Parked at the corner where the alley met the main road, engine running, windows tinted, It hadn't been there when we walked in. Or maybe it had, and I hadn't noticed because I was too busy confronting a dead man. My throat went dry, Brian. Don't say my name, he said immediately. The sharpness in his tone startled Charlotte, who tightened her grip on my coat. He softened instantly. I'm sorry, he murmured. Please. His eyes were alert now. Not tired. Not hollow. Calculating. I don't understand, I whispered. If your parents are dead, then who? My father had partners, he cut in, investors. Men who were loyal to him, not to me. The car's engine continued to hum softly at the end of the street. They weren't happy when he cut me off, Brian continued. It embarrassed him publicly. Made him look like he couldn't control his own son. You were disowned. Yes, he said, but I was still leverage. I stared at him. Leverage for what? For access, he said quietly, for appearances, for alliances. My marriage disrupted things that were already arranged. Arranged? My voice rose before I could stop it. You're telling me you were promised to someone? He flinched. Yes. The word detonated between us. Charlotte shifted restlessly, sensing the tension but not understanding it. She looked from me to him, confused. You never told me that, I said. I wasn't going to marry her, he replied immediately. I told them that. I chose you, but they didn't accept that. No. The black car's engine cut off. The silence that followed felt louder. My heartbeat began to pound in my ears. You need to listen carefully, Brian said, voice dropping lower. My parents are dead. That part is true. The jet crash was real. Then why are you still hiding? Because power doesn't die in a plane crash. The driver's side door of the black car opened. My stomach twisted. A man stepped out, well-dressed, clean-cut. Sunglasses despite the muted daylight. He looked like he belonged on a corporate billboard. He did not look like a thug. He scanned the street casually. Brian's posture changed instantly. He angled his body slightly, subtly blocking Charlotte from direct view. Is he one of them? I asked. Yes. The man at the end of the street spoke briefly into his phone. I couldn't hear the words. Brian leaned closer to me. They've been auditing the estate, he said quickly, after the crash. They expected to regain influence through me. You're legally dead, I whispered. Yes. Then how are they? Because legally dead doesn't mean erased, he said. My father's death transferred assets into trusts, controlled ones. They assumed I'd step into place quietly under the new identity. And you didn't. I did, he said, and there was bitterness there now. For a while, my head spun. You stayed with them? No, he said sharply. Not with them, but within reach. That was the deal. The man at the end of the alley began walking slowly toward us. Not rushing, not threatening, just approaching. Brian's eyes tracked him without turning his head fully. You said they were dead, I reminded him. He nodded once. They were supposed to lose interest in you and I did. Ice slid down my spine. And they didn't? They recently reopened some records, he said. Financial transfers. Anonymous support. My blood ran cold. What transfers? He looked at me. The money your parents received? The world seemed to tilt sideways. What are you talking about? You thought it was a government subsidy? He asked gently. I stared at him. 3 months after his death, my parents' small business had suddenly stabilized. An anonymous investor had covered their debts. The explanation had been vague but legitimate, some kind of regional development grant. You did that, I whispered. Yes. You said you couldn't watch me. I didn't watch, he said quietly. I monitored. The difference was razor thin. And now they've traced it? I asked. Not fully, he said, but enough to ask questions. The man was halfway down the alley now, close enough that I could see the shape of his mouth. Neutral, professional. He wasn't running. He wasn't yelling. That somehow made it worse. You need to leave, Brian said. Leave? I repeated incredulously. I just found out my husband is alive. Not here, he said urgently. Not with him watching. Who is he? Someone who reports. To whom? I asked. Brian didn't answer immediately. That told me everything. The man stopped about 20 feet away. Julian, he called out pleasantly. I felt something in my chest crack. Brian didn't react outwardly to the name, but his shoulders stiffened. I think you're mistaken, Brian replied calmly. The man smiled faintly. That's what you told the lady inside too. My pulse slammed into my throat. He had been in the store. Watching. The man's gaze shifted to me, then to Charlotte. Professional curiosity. Assessment. Charlotte hid partially behind my leg. Family? The man asked casually. No, Brian said smoothly. The lie was immediate, effortless. It hurt more than it should have. The man tilted his head slightly. She called you something else. Brian shrugged. Happens. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. There are people asking questions, he said lightly. You've been difficult to reach lately. I've been busy, Brian replied. I can see that. His gaze flicked to Charlotte again. Measured, calculating. A slow, creeping understanding began to settle in my chest. This wasn't over. Whatever Brian had tried to end 3 years ago had simply gone dormant. The man took another step forward. Your father's associates are eager to finalize matters, he continued. The estate transition has been delayed. I'll handle it, Brian said evenly. They're concerned you've become distracted. The word hung in the air like a blade. Brian didn't respond. The man studied him for a moment longer. Then he smiled again. I'll let them know you're cooperative. He turned without another word and walked back toward the car. Every second felt stretched thin as wire. The driver's door closed. The engine started again. The car drove off slowly, deliberately, not fleeing, not rushing, just leaving. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until it burned. Brian exhaled slowly. Charlotte looked up at him. Why was that man mean? She asked innocently. Brian crouched down again, his composure cracking slightly at the edges. He's not mean, he said gently. He just asks a lot of questions. Like Mama? She asked. A faint, broken smile touched his lips. Yes, he said softly, like your mama. I stood there, heart pounding. You lied, I said quietly. Yes. For 3 years. Yes. You and me bury you. He swallowed. Yes. You let me give birth alone. His voice almost failed. I know. I stared at him, trying to reconcile the man who made me tea during PMS week with the one who could orchestrate his own disappearance. You don't get to ask me to trust you, I said. I'm not, he replied. I'm asking you to be careful. The black car turned the corner at the end of the street and disappeared from view, but the feeling of being seen remained. What happens now? I asked. Brian stood slowly. His eyes, once warm and open in grocery store aisles and tiny apartments, were guarded now. They know I'm not as detached as they believed, he said. And that makes you and Charlotte visible. The word landed heavy. Visible, as if we had been hidden before. You said your parents threatened us once, I said. Are you saying these people would? I don't know. He cut in honestly. And that's what scares me. Charlotte reached for his hand again. He hesitated only a second before taking it. The image felt surreal. My daughter holding hands with the man I buried in my mind 3 years ago. You shouldn't have approached me, he said quietly. You shouldn't be alive, I shot back. A flicker of something almost like regret passed through his expression. I didn't expect to see you here, he admitted. Paris was supposed to be neutral. Neutral from what? From everything. I folded my arms, trying to steady myself. You owe me the full truth, I said. He nodded slowly. Yes. But not here, he added. There it was again. The insistence, the caution, the awareness that we were no longer alone in this story. Then where? I demanded. He glanced toward the main road, calculating distances in his head. I have a place, he said. The words were simple, but nothing about this was simple anymore. If this were a movie, that's the part where the audience would yell at the screen, "Don't go! Call the police! Run!" Instead, I looked at the man who used to hold me at 2 a.m. when nightmares crawled under my skin, and I tried to calculate whether he was more dangerous than the strangers who had just driven away in a black car. Where? I asked. 10 minutes from here, he said. Walking? No car? I don't keep one. Of course he didn't. He lived in cash payments and neutral clothing and alternate names. Charlotte tugged at my sleeve. Mama, I'm hungry. The normalcy of it nearly undid me. 3 years ago, I screamed his name into an ocean. Now I was standing in a Paris alley, debating whether to follow my resurrected husband to a second location while my toddler asked for a snack. I looked down at her. Her eyes were still on him. Curious. Hopeful. And something else I couldn't name without breaking. Fine, I said. Brian, Julian apparently, gave a short nod. We stepped back onto the main road. The city flowed around us as if nothing had ruptured. Cafes buzzed. Couples argued softly over espresso. A cyclist nearly clipped a tourist. Brian walked slightly ahead, not far enough to seem suspicious, not close enough to seem intimate. Every few seconds, his gaze swept storefront reflections. Checking, measuring. I hated that I understood what he was doing. We stopped at a small bakery on the corner. He stepped inside without asking and emerged 2 minutes later with a paper bag. He handed Charlotte a warm croissant. She accepted it like this was the most natural thing in the world. He remembered. She used to kick when I ate croissants during pregnancy. I hadn't told him that. He simply observed that back then, it seems. We walked another 5 minutes before he turned into a quieter residential street. Tall stone buildings, wrought iron balconies, laundry lines discreetly tucked away. He stopped in front of a building that looked older than both of us combined. No security guard, no concierge, just a brass buzzer panel. He pressed one button, no name beside it. The door clicked open. We climbed 3 flights of narrow stairs, no elevator, no hallway art, no security cameras that I could see. He unlocked the apartment door with a key, not a code. Inside, the space was minimal. Too minimal. A couch, a small table, a bookshelf half filled with French language texts, a kitchen with only essentials, no photographs, no personal clutter, no life. Charlotte stepped in first, curious. Brian closed the door quietly behind us and locked it. The sound echoed louder than it should have. I stood in the center of the room and turned slowly. You live like this? I asked. It's temporary. How temporary? He didn't answer. Charlotte wandered toward the couch and climbed onto it, still clutching her pastry. Brian remained standing by the door for a moment longer, listening. For what? I wasn't sure. Then he finally faced me fully. This isn't how I wanted you to find out, he said. How did you want me to find out? I shot back. At your funeral sequel? His jaw flexed. You deserve the whole truth, he said. Yes, I do. He took a slow breath, like he was stepping back into something he'd been avoiding for years. When my parents disowned me, it wasn't emotional, he began. It was strategic. I folded my arms. They cut me off publicly, he continued. But privately, they assumed I would come back once things got difficult. They underestimated you. They underestimated how much I loved you, he corrected. I didn't soften. When you got pregnant, he went on, they saw it as escalation. How so? I asked. A permanent tie. Something that would make it harder for me to return to their version of my life. Is that when the threats started? He nodded. They never contacted you directly. That would have been too obvious. They contacted me. What did they say? His eyes flicked briefly to Charlotte before returning to me. They said accidents happen. The room felt colder. Be specific, I said. They said medical complications can be encouraged, that car brakes fail, that financial audits ruin small businesses. My stomach turned. You're saying they would have hurt my parents too? Yes. And you believe them? I knew them, he said simply. Silence stretched between us. So you chose to fake your death, I said flatly. It wasn't a dramatic choice, he replied. It was negotiated. The word sent a chill through me. Negotiated with who? With my father. You just said they were threatening you. They were, he'd said, and I told him I would remove myself completely if he guaranteed your safety. By erasing your presence? Yes, legally and publicly. The ocean flashed in my mind again, the wave, the scream. You staged it, I said. Yes. With lifeguards involved? No. The answer surprised me. The current that day was strong, he said. We knew that. You planned it around the tide, I realized. He nodded once. There were people positioned further out. My heart pounded. You let me watch. His voice broke slightly. That wasn't part of it. You walked into the water, knowing what would happen. Yes, he said, ashamed. And you let me believe you were drowning. I didn't think they'd let it go that far, he said. I thought they'd pull me sooner. Rage flared hot and sharp. You let me scream your name, I said angrily. His composure cracked fully then. I know, he said, almost a whisper. Charlotte looked between us. Mama? She asked softly. I swallowed hard. I'm okay, I told her automatically. Brian ran a hand through his hair. When the wave hit, he continued, I lost sight of the timing. The extraction took longer than planned. Extraction, I repeated, disgusted. Yes. You could have died. I almost did. The admission hung heavy. When they pulled me out further down the coast, I was unconscious. I stared at him. They resuscitated me, he said quietly. And by the time I woke up, the story was already circulating. Missing. Presumed drowned. No body recovered. You went along with it, I said. I had to. You always have a choice. He shook his head. Not when they can reach you from anywhere. Charlotte slid off the couch and walked toward him again. He froze for half a second, then crouched automatically. She placed her small hand on his chest. Are you my daddy? She asked plainly. The room held its breath. He looked at her like she was something fragile and sacred and devastating all at once. Yes, he said. No hesitation this time. Yes, I am. The word felt like both a gift and a wound. Charlotte nodded once, satisfied, and wrapped her arms around his neck. This time, he didn't hold back. He pulled her into him carefully, like he was afraid she'd vanish if he held too tightly. I watched his face as he closed his eyes. 3 years of absence folded inward in that single moment. Your parents died, I said quietly. They did? Then what else is expected of you from these men? He stood slowly, Charlotte still clinging to him, because when my father died, he said, his partners expected control. Control of what? Everything, and I am in their way. Why not just disappear again? He met my gaze, because now you've seen me. The truth of that settled heavily. If I vanish again, he continued, they'll assume you're connected. You think they don't already? They suspect, he said. Suspicion is manageable. Confirmation isn't. I paced once across the small room, trying to think. So what's your plan? I asked. He hesitated. I was going to finalize the estate transfer. Quietly. Sever ties. Move further under. Under where exactly do you mean? I asked impatiently. Tapping my foot against the wood. South America, he said. Or Southeast Asia. Somewhere with fewer digital trails. And leave us again? His silence clarified what his words failed to. I laughed once, sharp. You don't get to make that decision anymore. He nodded slowly. I know. Charlotte tugged on his sleeve. Can we go to the park? she asked. The innocence of it cut through everything. He smiled faintly, maybe. He said softly. I looked at him. You said they reopened records, I began, because of the money. Yes. How much did they know? Enough to question, not enough to act yet. I stopped pacing. A new realization settled in. You didn't expect to see me today, I said. No. You weren't planning on telling me? He hesitated a second before solemnly admitting, no. Then what changed? He looked at Charlotte again, then back at me. You said my name, he confessed simply. And I realized I didn't want to pretend anymore. The room went quiet. 3 years ago, he walked into the ocean believing distance would keep us safe. Now he stood in front of me, alive, hunted, and carrying more regret than I could measure. You don't get forgiveness just because you look tired, I said. I know. You don't get redemption because she hugged you. I know. But you don't get to disappear again either. His eyes searched mine carefully. What are you saying? I looked at my daughter, then back at the man who once chose me over wealth and legacy. I'm saying, I said slowly, if they want to control you, they don't get to do it alone. For the first time since I saw him in that grocery aisle, something different replaced the fear in his eyes. Not relief. Not triumph. Resolve. The war he tried to fight alone 3 years ago was no longer his to fight by himself. And somewhere outside, in a city that had no idea how close it was to our fracture, a black car circled back into traffic. This wasn't over. But for the first time since the ocean swallowed him, he wasn't facing it alone. The apartment was quiet. Charlotte had finally curled up on the small couch with her croissant, her eyes bright with the contentment only toddlers know when they've been reassured by presence rather than words. Brian, alive, exhausted, hunted, and impossibly real, stood in the center of the room, watching me, measuring what I would do next. I could feel him calculating, second-guessing, holding back pieces of truth he still hadn't revealed. But I was done standing still. I need every detail, I said, voice steady now. Everything. No more omissions, no more half-truths. You owe me that after 3 years, after pretending you were dead, after leaving me to fight through labor and newborn nights alone. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging. For the first time, I saw him not as the man I loved or the man who haunted my dreams, but as the man crushed under circumstances he never asked for. I didn't plan to survive the baby moon, he admitted quietly. I only wanted a memory, a final one. I needed to see you one last time. Then I was supposed to vanish. My disappearance was clean, legally undeniable. I would live elsewhere under another name. Your life, Charlotte's life, would be safe. Safe? I echoed. You call watching me give birth alone, nearly dying, losing you, safe? My chest heaved. The memory of sand, screams, and helplessness rushed back. I grieved you. I named our daughter alone. I raised her alone. He flinched as though my words struck harder than the waves ever could. I know, and every day since I have hated myself. I sent money, discreetly. I checked on you from afar, every hospital visit, every doctor appointment, every struggle your parents faced with Charlotte. I couldn't be there, but I was still tethered, remotely. You were tethered, I said, letting the word echo, but you were still gone. You didn't even know our daughter's name. And now, you're here, and being hunted. Yet, you didn't even warn me. Brian shook his head. I couldn't. If they knew I reached you directly, it would have been over for all of us. I thought I could handle it, alone, but I was wrong. I never accounted for them moving faster than I anticipated. I studied him. 3 years of imagined grief, resentment, and anger condensed into this one man standing before me. He had survived an ocean, deceit, and enemies I had never seen. And yet he had carried love and loyalty through all of it. Charlotte tugged at his sleeve again, and he knelt, her small arms wrapped around his neck tightly. His eyes closed for a moment, and I could see the cracks in his stoicism, the relief of touch. The weight of absence finally softened, if only slightly. Look at her, I said softly. She's our daughter, Brian. She's your daughter. His eyes opened, looking at me, then Charlotte, and I saw the raw truth in them. His voice was rough, hoarse, with years of unspoken words. I never stopped thinking of her. Of you. Every day I tried to justify the distance. I told myself it was protection, but protection is nothing without presence. The tension in the room shifted. The fear of being hunted remained, yes, but it no longer overshadowed the possibility of something else. Hope. Forgiveness. Redemption. The thought surprised me. How quickly it settled in the cracks left by 3 years of grief. You're not gone anymore, I said. You can't be. Not now. He looked at me like he'd been waiting to hear that for years. Do you forgive me? His voice was small, tentative, fragile in a way that cut deeper than anger ever could. I hesitated. 3 years of betrayal, absence, and deception sat heavy in my chest. But then I looked at Charlotte. At her small, trusting eyes, the same shade of brown that had always belonged to him. at the way she hesitated, then leaned against him again, as if instinctively knowing the bond we could never erase. I exhaled, slowly, long, the weight of grief lifting just enough to allow something lighter in its place. Yes, I said, I forgive you, but not yet. Not until you get rid of whatever trouble you're involved in. Brian's shoulders visibly relaxed. The tension in his jaw melted. Thank you, he whispered. I didn't know if I'd ever hear that. We sat on the couch, Charlotte between us, her small hands holding his. It felt surreal to touch him, to have him finally present, to reconcile the memory of the man I loved with the reality of the man who had survived everything for us. Hours passed in quiet conversation. He explained everything he could, carefully, deliberately. How the threats had arrived, how he had negotiated his fake death, how he had been living under a different identity, how he had kept tabs on us while ensuring no direct contact, how his parents' death in the jet crash had left him with their wealth and with enemies still expecting control, and how he had feared that appearing again too soon might destroy everything he had been protecting. Charlotte giggled at something he whispered to her. Her laughter was soft, innocent, and the sound seemed to anchor him to this reality, the one he had fought to return to without losing her or me. I don't know how to explain the rest of it, he said finally, leaning back against the couch. But I promise. From now on, I'm here. No disappearing, no hiding. We find a way to live. Together. And I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. Always. I studied his face, worn, tired, but undeniably alive. Alive for us. Alive for Charlotte. Alive enough to make up for all the years he had been a ghost in our lives. I don't know what comes next, I said, but we start here. Together. And we figure it out. Brian nodded. Together. The city outside continued to hum with life, oblivious to the reunion taking place in this small Parisian apartment. I realized then that this wasn't just a chance at forgiveness. It was a chance at reclaiming everything we thought we had lost. A second chance not just for love, but for family. Charlotte yawned and curled against Brian's chest. He wrapped his arms around her carefully, protective, reverent. I felt the knot of grief that had lived in my chest for 3 years begin to loosen. The waves of the past could no longer pull me under. Not now. Not when he was here. Not when the little life we created together was here, thriving, innocent, and whole. I knelt beside them and placed a hand on his shoulder. We'll take it one day at a time, I said. He looked at me, a small, weary smile breaking across his face for the first time in years. Outside, the Parisian sunlight slanted through the windows, casting long, warm shadows on the floor. And for the first time since that tragic day at the ocean, I allowed myself to believe that love could survive even the most impossible of circumstances. We had been through death, betrayal, threats that reached beyond the grave, and yet here we were, alive, together, a family reunited against impossible odds. And somehow, that was enough. Because sometimes, survival isn't just about making it through the storm. It's about returning to the people who make the storm worth surviving. Charlotte stirred, blinking sleepily up at us. Brian kissed the top of her head. I caught his eyes for a long, steady moment. The weight of the past was heavy, but finally, we could begin again. And this time, no ocean, no threat, no shadow would ever take him from us again. We didn't fight them with violence, that would have been predictable and stupid. Brian's father built his empire on reputation, leverage, and fear. The men who circled him now, polished, quiet, strategic, thrived in shadows. They didn't threaten loudly. They nudged, cornered, suffocated. So we did the one thing they didn't anticipate. We turned on the lights. It started with paperwork. Brian still had access, limited, but real, to the estate's internal structure. Trusts. Shell companies. Silent partnerships that were never meant to withstand scrutiny. Only obedience. For years, he had complied just enough to stay invisible. Now, he stopped complying. He requested formal audits. He hired an independent forensic accounting firm under his legal identity, his real one. Resurrected through court petition once we retained the right attorney. The dead status that had once protected us became leverage when inconsistencies in the original disappearance were quietly disclosed in sealed testimony. His father's former partners believed control depended on silence. They were wrong. When Brian formally reasserted himself as the legal heir, backed by documentation of coercion and evidence of threats, they didn't panic. First, they assumed he was bluffing, until subpoenas followed. The man from the alley, Julian's handler, was the first to fold. Not dramatically, not publicly. He simply distanced himself when investigators began tracing offshore transfers that had been routed improperly through estate-controlled trusts. Power doesn't like exposure, it fractures under it. The jet crash had already weakened the structure. Brian's father had been the spine. Without him, loyalty was contractual, not emotional. And contracts unravel when risk outweighs reward. The real turning point came when Brian released a controlled statement through legal channels, not to media, not to tabloids, but to the board members quietly benefiting from the estate's shadow dealings. He didn't accuse. He offered immunity in exchange for testimony. Within weeks, internal alliances shifted. Assets froze. Partnerships dissolved. The black car stopped appearing. One by one, the men who had once treated our lives as negotiable liabilities withdrew to protect themselves. No arrests, no cinematic courtroom climax. Just quiet financial collapse and strategic distancing. The estate was restructured under full legal compliance. The trusts were dissolved. The offshore accounts closed or surrendered. Brian relinquished the majority of the wealth voluntarily. He liquidated what was necessary, transferred portions into transparent holdings, and severed operational ties completely. "You're walking away from everything," I stated evenly the night he signed the final documents. He looked at Charlotte asleep on the couch between us. "I already chose everything that mattered to me. This inheritance has always been a burden, a reason to pull me away from my family, and I don't want that any longer," he replied. And that was that. Power built on intimidation cannot survive sunlight and indifference. By the time the last legal threads were cut, there was nothing left for them to hold over us. No leverage, no secrets, no silence, just a man who refused to be controlled anymore. We left Paris months later, not running, not hiding, but relocating by choice. New city, new home, no enemies. Brian sleeps through the night now. Charlotte doesn't remember the tension in that alley. To her, her father simply came back from a very long trip. My parents moved in the house across ours, and now, Charlotte and I get to live together with our complete family. Sometimes I still wake up from dreams of waves, but when I reach beside me, he's there. Not a ghost, not a memory, not a man owned by someone else's legacy. Just my husband. Alive. And finally free.